they're going to arrest you.
It's not the police I'm worried about. The people that are doing this broke the only rule that matters to them.
Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
The night that changed everything began like any other humid evening in the heart of the city, where the skyline shimmered under a haze of orange streetlights and distant sirens echoed like restless ghosts. He had promised himself he was done with violence, done with bloodshed, and done with the kind of life that demanded looking over his shoulder every few seconds. For years, he had buried the man he used to be beneath layers of routine and silence. He kept to himself, worked long hours at the docks, and avoided attention. To most people, he was just another quiet laborer with a hardened expression and scars that told stories no one dared to ask about. But fate has a cruel way of digging up the past when it senses weakness, and that night it chose him again. He was closing up the warehouse when the first sign of trouble appeared. A black SUV parked across the street with its engine running. The windows were tinted to dark, and the silhouette inside remained still, watching. He felt it immediately, that old instinct awakening like a predator stirred from sleep. Years ago, that instinct had kept him alive in places where bullets were currency and trust was a death sentence. He told himself it was nothing, just paranoia, but the tension in his chest tightened. When he stepped outside, the air felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if the city itself knew what was coming. The gunshots erupted without warning. Sharp, explosive cracks that shattered the illusion of normalcy. Workers scattered in panic, diving behind crates and vehicles. Glass exploded from the warehouse windows, raining down in glittering shards. He moved before he even thought about it, tackling a young coworker out of the line of fire. The SUV doors swung open, and masked men poured out, armed and methodical. This wasn't random violence. This was organized, precise, targeted, and deep down, he knew it had something to do with him. In the chaos, he caught a glimpse of one of the attacker's eyes through the masked cold, calculating, familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. He grabbed a steel pipe from the ground and charged forward, the old version of himself resurfacing in full force. Years of restraint evaporated in seconds. He moved with lethal efficiency, disarming one man and striking another before they could adjust. But they weren't amateurs. They regrouped quickly, firing again, forcing him back. Tires screeched as more vehicles arrived, blocking off the exits. This was an ambush designed with military precision. Inside the warehouse, flames began to rise. One of the attackers had tossed a Molotov cocktail near the fuel drums. Fire crawled across the floor like a living creature, devouring everything in its path. Smoke thickened the air, stinging eyes and choking lungs. He fought his way through it, pulling 2 injured men toward the emergency exit. Every second felt stretched and distorted, like time itself refused to move fast enough. The screams of the trapped workers burned into his ears, mixing with the roar of fire and the relentless gunfire outside. When he finally burst through the back door, dragging the last survivor with him, he saw her. She had come to pick him up early, worried about the late shift. She was standing near her car, frozen in horror as the chaos unfolded. Their eyes met for a brief, fragile moment. He shouted for her to get down, but the warning came too late. A single shot rang out, cutting through everything else. She fell, collapsing against the pavement as if the world had simply switched her off. The sound of that bullet seemed louder than all the others combined. Something inside him shattered beyond repair. The careful life he had built, the promises he had made to leave violence behind, all turned to ash in that instant. He rushed to her side, cradling her as blood stained his hands. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes struggling to focus on his face. She tried to speak, but only a faint whisper escaped her lips. In that broken murmur, she asked him not to go back to who he used to be. It was a plea filled with fear and love, a desperate hope that he wouldn't let hatred consume him again. Then her hand went limp. The attackers retreated as quickly as they had come, disappearing into the night like shadows dissolving at dawn. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, but they felt meaningless now. He remained there on the cold pavement, unmoving, holding her lifeless body while the fire consumed the warehouse behind him. The world blurred into a haze of flashing lights and shouting officers, but he heard none of it. All he felt was the steady, suffocating weight of loss pressing down on his chest. At the hospital, the doctors spoke in clinical tones about ballistic trajectories and irreparable damage. Their words were distant, mechanical. To him, there was only silence. He sat in the waiting room long after they had covered her with a sheet, staring at the dried blood beneath his fingernails. He recognized the precision of the attack now. It wasn't about the warehouse. It wasn't about random terror. It was a message. Someone from his past had found him. Someone powerful enough to orchestrate a massacre just to draw him out. When he returned home before dawn, the apartment felt hollow, stripped of warmth. He stood in the dim kitchen light, staring at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him wasn't the quiet dock worker anymore. The calm mask had cracked, revealing the hardened operative he once was, man trained for war, shaped by betrayal, and feared in places most people couldn't pronounce. He opened a locked drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay an old handgun, meticulously cleaned, and a faded photograph from a life he had tried to forget. That brutal incident didn't just take someone he loved. It resurrected a version of him the world had once known as unstoppable. The city would soon learn that when you corner a man who has nothing left to lose, you don't awaken fury. And this time, he wouldn't stop at survival. This time, there would be no mercy. There would be no mercy. The night that changed everything began like any other humid evening in the Long before the city knew him as a quiet dock worker with calloused hands and distant eyes, he had been a man forged in violence. His real name had once carried weight in classified briefings and whispered conversations in secure rooms. He had operated in places erased from maps, in conflicts governments denied existed. The world he came from was built on secrecy, precision, and the understanding that mercy was a weakness no one could afford. Back then, he didn't question orders. He executed them with mechanical efficiency, believing that discipline and loyalty were the only truths that mattered. His recruitment had been almost inevitable. As a young soldier, he stood out not because he talked too much or sought attention, but because he didn't. He absorbed information quickly, adapted faster than others, and showed an unsettling calm under fire. During a hostage rescue operation that went disastrously wrong, he had disobeyed a direct command to retreat. Instead, he infiltrated the building alone and extracted the captives one by one, neutralizing threats without hesitation. The mission report labeled his actions as reckless brilliance. A week later, a man in a grey suit approached him with an offer that would change the course of his life. The training that followed stripped him of everything human. Sleep became a luxury. Pain became a teacher. He learned languages in fragments, memorized psychological profiles, and mastered weapons from every corner of the world. They taught him how to disappear in plain sight, how to break a man's will with a single look, how to survive in isolation for weeks without losing focus. But what they never told him was what it would cost. Each assignment chipped away at something inside him. Each target eliminated left behind a faint echo that followed him into the night. His missions grew darker over time. What started as counter-terror operations shifted into covert assassinations and destabilization efforts. He was sent to remove threats before they became headlines. Politicians called it preemptive security. He knew it was something else. In one operation deep in Eastern Europe, he was ordered to eliminate a supposed arms dealer. When he arrived at the location, he discovered the man wasn't alone. There were children in the house, family members who were never mentioned in the intelligence brief. The mission parameters didn't change. The order remained absolute. That night, he followed through, but something in him fractured beyond repair. The nightmares began soon after. Faces he had never learned the names of haunted his sleep. He would wake in cold sweats, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The agency psychologists called it operational fatigue. They prescribed rest periods and reassigned him temporarily. But rest didn't erase memory. It only made the silence louder. He started questioning the morality of what he was doing, though he never voiced it aloud. In his line of work, doubt was considered a liability, and liabilities were removed. The breaking point came during a mission that was meant to be routine. He and his team were tasked with intercepting a convoy transporting sensitive data. The ambush was perfectly planned, or so they thought. What they didn't know was that someone had leaked their approach. As they moved in, they were surrounded by enemy forces lying in wait. The firefight was brutal and immediate. He watched two of his closest teammates fall within seconds, their bodies collapsing beside him in a spray of dust and blood. He managed to fight his way out, dragging a wounded comrade through gunfire. But by the time extraction arrived, only he was still standing. Back at headquarters, the narrative was controlled. The mission was declared a partial success. Blame was quietly shifted onto the fallen operatives for tactical miscalculations. He knew it was a lie. Someone inside had betrayed them. When he pressed for answers, he was met with silence and thinly veiled warnings. The message was clear: stop digging. But he couldn't. The sense of injustice burned deeper than any physical wound. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just a weapon in their arsenal. He was expendable. He began gathering information discreetly, tracing communications and analyzing discrepancies in mission logs. The deeper he went, the more he uncovered a network of corruption that reached higher than he had imagined. Operations were being manipulated for profit. Lives were being sacrificed to protect hidden agendas. The ideals he once believed in duty, honor, country felt like hollow slogans masking something rotten at the core. When he finally confronted his superior officer, the meeting ended not with answers, but with a thin smile and a subtle threat disguised as concern for his mental health. That night, he made a decision that few in his world survived. He walked away. He erased his digital footprint, liquidated hidden assets, and disappeared before they could officially brand him a liability. It wasn't easy. Leaving meant becoming a ghost hunted by the very system that had trained him. For months, he moved from city to city, avoiding surveillance, trusting no one. Eventually, the pursuit cooled. Perhaps they decided he wasn't worth the trouble, or perhaps they believed time would break him. Instead, time only hardened his resolve to never return. Years later, when he settled into the anonymity of dock work, he convinced himself he could live quietly. He kept his head down, avoided attachments, and locked away the part of him that had once thrived in chaos. But darkness doesn't vanish simply because you ignore it. It waits, patient and persistent. The brutal incident that tore his world apart wasn't random. It was a reminder. His past had not forgotten him. And now, with nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose, the man with the dark past would no longer run from the shadows. He would step back into them, this time on his own terms. Long before the flames consumed the warehouse and gunfire shattered the fragile peace he had built, something far more calculated had been unfolding in the shadows of the city. Power had been quietly shifting hands. Old criminal networks that once operated with predictable codes were collapsing, replaced by a new force that didn't believe in negotiation or tradition. This wasn't just another gang seeking territory. This was a syndicate built on precision, intelligence, and absolute dominance, and its rise had been anything but accidental. It began with whispers in underground circles, small-time operators disappearing, shipments rerouted without explanation, and entire crews wiped out overnight. The police called it gang rivalry escalation, but those who truly understood the streets sensed something different. The attacks were too clean, too coordinated. Each move seemed designed not only to eliminate competition, but to send a message. Resist, and you vanish without a trace. Within months, fear spread faster than any rumor. Businesses that once paid protection money to familiar faces found new collectors at their doors, colder and far less forgiving. At the center of this transformation was a figure few had actually seen. He didn't parade through nightclubs or flaunt his wealth on social media like the crime bosses of old. Instead, he operated through layers of intermediaries, shielding himself behind a network of loyal lieutenants. Those who had encountered him described a man with unsettling composure, someone who spoke softly but carried an authority that felt absolute. He wasn't driven by ego. He was driven by structure. His empire was organized like a corporation, complete with logistics divisions, financial analysts, and security specialists recruited from military backgrounds. The syndicate's first major power play came when they seized control of the city's port operations. What had once been fragmented between rival factions suddenly fell under a single banner. Containers began arriving and departing without interference. Customs officials who questioned irregularities found themselves transferred, silenced, or disgraced by fabricated scandals. The flow of illegal weapons and synthetic drugs increased exponentially, flooding not just the city but neighboring regions. Profits soared, and with them, influence. Politicians who once campaigned on anti-crime platforms quietly adjusted their priorities. Violence, however, remained the syndicate's most effective currency. They understood that fear was more reliable than loyalty. When a prominent rival refused to relinquish his territory, his entire operation was dismantled in a single night. Surveillance cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. Emergency response times were inexplicably delayed. By sunrise, what remained of his crew was scattered across abandoned warehouses as a warning. The message was clear. Compliance ensured survival. Defiance guaranteed obliteration. The city began to change, its nightlife dimmer, its streets quieter after dark. What made this syndicate different from those before it was its adaptability. They embraced technology with ruthless efficiency. Encrypted communication channels replaced disposable phones. Financial transactions were laundered through layers of digital currency and offshore accounts. They recruited hackers alongside enforcers, understanding that modern warfare wasn't fought solely with bullets. Data breaches crippled businesses that resisted their demands. Blackmail became a strategic tool, ensuring cooperation without firing a single shot. It was a new era of organized crime, streamlined, intelligent, and terrifyingly efficient. Behind the scenes, alliances were forged with international players. Arms dealers from Eastern Europe, cybercriminals from Asia, and cartel representatives from across oceans found common ground in profit and ambition. The syndicate wasn't content with local dominance. It envisioned expansion. The city served as a testing ground, a prototype for a larger network that could span continents. With each successful operation, their confidence grew. They no longer hid in shadows out of necessity but out of strategy. Law enforcement agencies sensed the shift but struggled to respond. Informants dried up, either too frightened or too compromised to speak. Investigations stalled when evidence vanished or key witnesses recanted. Task forces were assembled and disbanded as political pressure mounted. Some officers began to suspect infiltration within their own ranks. Trust eroded internally, mirroring the fear gripping the streets. The syndicate thrived in that uncertainty, exploiting every crack in the system meant to stop them. For the man who had tried to bury his past, the rise of this syndicate was not entirely invisible. Even as he worked quietly at the docks, he noticed changes. The new supervisors who monitored shipments with unusual scrutiny, the armed men who lingered longer than necessary, the subtle tension among workers who knew better than to ask questions. He recognized the patterns. This wasn't chaotic criminality. It was strategic consolidation. And deep down, a cold realization formed. The attack that destroyed his world bore the fingerprints of an organization like this. The syndicate's rise was not simply about money or territory. It was about control over fear, over information, over the very rhythm of the city. They operated with patience, waiting for the right moment to eliminate threats that could disrupt their ascent. And when they struck, it was decisive. The brutal incident that shattered his life wasn't a random act of violence. It was part of a larger design. In their quest for absolute power, they had awakened someone who understood systems like theirs intimately. Someone who knew how such empires were built and how they could be dismantled from within. In organizations built on secrecy and control, Betrayal is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself with raised voices or obvious defiance. Instead, it moves quietly through corridors, hidden in coded messages and subtle glances exchanged in rooms where loyalty is supposed to be absolute. The syndicate that had risen to power prided itself on discipline and internal unity. But beneath the polished surface of its operations, fractures were beginning to form. Ambition and fear, when mixed together, have a way of turning even the most loyal soldiers into conspirators. For years, the syndicate's structure had been airtight. Each division operated independently, sharing only what was necessary. Orders flowed downward, profits flowed upward, and questions were discouraged. Those who followed commands were rewarded generously. Those who hesitated were removed. But power creates hunger, and hunger breeds resentment. Some of the mid-level commanders who had helped build the empire began to feel overlooked. They risked their lives while the unseen leader remained protected behind layers of security and anonymity. Quiet dissatisfaction began to grow like rot behind a flawless wall. One of those commanders was a man known for his precision and ruthlessness. He had overseen multiple successful operations, including the violent consolidation of the docks. His reputation within the syndicate was formidable, yet he was never invited into the inner circle. He received instructions through encrypted channels, never face-to-face meetings. At first, he accepted it as operational necessity. Over time, however, suspicion replaced obedience. He began to wonder whether he was merely a disposable asset, just another tool to be discarded when convenient. The first act of betrayal wasn't dramatic. It was a small leak of information, subtle enough to avoid immediate detection. A shipment schedule altered slightly, a security route shared with an external contact. The intention wasn't to destroy the syndicate outright, but to test the waters, to see how resilient the structure truly was. When nothing catastrophic happened, his confidence grew. He began cultivating secret alliances with rivals who had been pushed to the margins during the syndicate's rise. He promised them opportunity in exchange for loyalty once the leadership shifted. Meanwhile, internal security within the syndicate grew stricter. Financial discrepancies were noticed. Communication patterns were flagged. The unseen leader understood one fundamental truth: no empire collapses from external pressure alone. It implodes from within. Surveillance intensified, not just on outsiders but on trusted lieutenants. Paranoia began spreading through the ranks. Meetings grew shorter. Conversations became guarded. Even long-standing partnerships felt strained under the weight of suspicion. The betrayal deepened when the commander made a reckless decision. He orchestrated an unauthorized strike against a rival faction, hoping to claim credit and demonstrate his indispensability. The attack succeeded tactically, but disrupted larger negotiations that the syndicate had been quietly conducting. When the leader learned of this deviation, the response was swift and cold. A private summons was issued. For the first time, the commander would meet the man he had both served and secretly plotted against. The meeting took place in an abandoned industrial complex far from the city center. Security was overwhelming. Silent men stationed at every corner. The commander entered with confidence, masked as calm. Inside, he finally saw the face behind the Empira man whose demeanor was composed, almost unreadable. There were no raised voices, no accusations hurled across the room. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement of facts. Evidence was presented with surgical precision: intercepted communications, financial transfers, unauthorized movements. The betrayal had been known long before the commander realized he was being watched. What followed was not an immediate execution, but something far more chilling. The leader offered him a choice: complete loyalty moving forward, proven through a task that would erase any doubt, or irreversible consequences. The task was simple in description, but brutal in implicational, and it's someone the commander once considered a close ally, someone who had unknowingly been drawn into his secret dealings. It was a test designed to sever emotional ties and reassert dominance. In that moment, betrayal collided with survival. The commander complied. Fear overpowered ambition. The ally was lured into a meeting under false pretenses and executed without warning. The act sent a clear message through the syndicate's ranks. Dissent would be exposed, and loyalty would be proven in blood. Outwardly, unity appeared restored. Internally, however, trust was shattered. Every member now understood that they were being watched, evaluated, and measured constantly. The atmosphere shifted from confident expansion to tense preservation. Unbeknownst to them, this internal fracture would have far-reaching consequences. The commander's initial leak of information had not gone unnoticed by external forces. Fragments of data had reached unexpected hands, including someone who understood betrayal better than most. For the man whose life had been destroyed, the knowledge that the syndicate was not as unified as it appeared became a weapon. Empires built on fear can withstand external assaults, but once doubt seeps into their foundations, collapse becomes inevitable. And as betrayal festered within the syndicate's core, the stage was being set for a reckoning none of them could fully anticipate. Grief had sharpened his instincts, but revenge required more than anger. It demanded strategy, patience, and information. He understood the syndicate structure well enough to know that charging in blindly would be suicide. They had resources, manpower, and surveillance capabilities that could track him the moment he made a careless move. If he wanted to dismantle them piece by piece, he needed someone on the inside, someone who had as much to lose as he did. The problem was finding a person willing to betray an organization that punished disloyalty with merciless efficiency. The opportunity came unexpectedly through a name he hadn't heard in years. She had once been an intelligence analyst attached to operations he had led overseas, brilliant, methodical, and fiercely principled. Back then, she believed in the system as much as he once had. But systems change, and people either adapt or break. Rumors suggested she had resurfaced in the city, working privately as a cybersecurity consultant after leaving government service under unclear circumstances. When he dug deeper, he discovered something else. She had recently been investigating irregular financial patterns tied to port activity. Their reunion was far from warm. When he approached her in a quiet cafe tucked between office towers, she recognized him instantly, though surprise quickly hardened into caution. She knew what kind of man he used to be and likely suspected what had brought him back into motion. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid out what he knew about the syndicate, the attack, the docks, the silent takeover. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia fueled by grief. But when he showed her fragments of evidence he had gathered, the same analytical spark ignited in her eyes. She had her own reasons for mistrust. Months earlier, she had uncovered encrypted transactions linking prominent business leaders to offshore accounts that mirrored known syndicate patterns. When she attempted to report her findings through official channels, she was warned to drop it. Shortly after, her contract was terminated under the guise of budget restructuring. She understood what that meant. The syndicate's influence reached further than she had imagined, and anyone digging too deeply became a liability. Forming an alliance was not a decision either of them took lightly. Trust between former operatives is fragile, especially when both carry scars from betrayal. They established strict boundaries from the beginning. Information would be verified independently. Meetings would rotate locations. Communication would be layered through encrypted channels she designed herself. She would provide intelligence, financial trails, digital footprints, structural vulnerabilities. He would handle what he did best: infiltration, pressure, and when necessary, force. Their partnership began cautiously. She traced shell companies connected to the port operations, mapping out a web of transactions that revealed the syndicate's economic backbone. He used that intelligence to intercept smaller operations, disrupting supply chains without drawing immediate attention. Each calculated strike was designed to test the syndicate's response time and internal communication flow. They weren't trying to win yet. They were studying the battlefield. As days turned into weeks, a rhythm developed between them. She operated from a secured workspace filled with screens streaming real-time data, while he moved through the city's underbelly, confronting informants and observing patterns firsthand. When he returned with fragments of overheard conversations or subtle behavioral shifts among dock supervisors, she integrated them into her broader analysis. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged. The syndicate wasn't just a criminal enterprise, functioned like a shadow government, with contingency plans and redundancies built into every division. The danger of their alliance became evident when the syndicate began tightening digital security protocols. Someone had noticed anomalies. Surveillance around key financial hubs increased. A suspicious vehicle lingered near her office one evening longer than coincidence would allow. She realized then that they were not invisible. The risk was escalating, and continuing meant crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She confronted him about it, questioning whether vengeance was worth the potential cost of their lives. He didn't answer with promises or reassurances. He spoke plainly about what had been taken from him, and what the syndicate represented: a system of corruption that would continue destroying lives unchecked. He admitted that he couldn't do this alone. That acknowledgement, rare and unguarded, shifted something between them. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about preventing further damage. She saw in his determination not blind rage, but controlled resolve. Against her better judgment, she chose to stay. Their alliance reached a turning point when she uncovered evidence of internal fractures within the syndicate's leadership. Encrypted messages hinted at distrust among mid-level commanders. Financial reallocations suggested contingency planning. She presented the findings to him with a single conclusion: the syndicate was vulnerable, but only if the pressure was applied precisely. Exploiting internal betrayal could cause a cascade effect, weakening their cohesion from within. It was a risky strategy, but one that aligned with his understanding of how such organizations collapse. By the time they finalized their plan, they both understood the stakes. If discovered, there would be no negotiations, no escape routes. The syndicate would eliminate them without hesitation. Yet danger had become a shared burden, binding them in a way neither had anticipated. What began as a cautious collaboration had evolved into a calculated partnership built on mutual respect and necessity. In a city controlled by fear, they had found strength in unity, and together they prepared to strike at the heart of an empire that believed itself untouchable.
The first signs of Columbus were subtle, almost imperceptible to those who were not looking closely. A shipment delayed, share a warehouse raid there, whisper spreading through back channel that something was wrong. But In a city balanced on occupation and quiet deals, it does not take much to tip the scale. What had once been carefully controlled criminal ecosystem began to destabilize. The syndicate grip, once firm and methodical, started tightening in response to unseen pressure, and being powerful organization tighten their grip to hard things break. It began at the docks. A major weapon shipment vanished before it could be distributed inland. Surveillance cameras malfunctioned simultaneously across their loading zones, but the time syndicate enforcer arrived, the contents were empty and two of their own men were unconsciously left alive but humiliated. The message was deliberate. Someone was testing them, exposing weakness without claiming territory. The leadership responded immediately, doubling patrols and interrogating workers. Fear spread quickly among the laborers, many of whom had families caught in the crossfire of escalating power plays. Soon after, the financial sector felt the tremor. Anonymous leaks exposed suspicious transactions tied to prominent businessmen. News outlet picked up fragment of the story, enough to raise public suspension, but not enough to draw clear conclusion. Stocks dipped, investor panicked behind closed doors. Emergency meetings were helped to contain reputational damage. The syndicate had relied on invisibility to thrive. Now it was being draped into partial light. Paranoia inflected their ranks, and paranoia makes powerful men reckless. Street level violence escalated as a result. Mid-tier commander, desperate to prove loyalty, launched aggressive crackdown on rival faction. Nightclubs were raided, safe houses torched, and suspected informants dragged into alleys for brutal questioning. The streets echoed with sceneries more frequently than before. Citizens began avoiding downtown after sunset. Social media filled with shaky footage of masked gunmen and burning vehicles, the illusion of stability that city officials had carefully curated was unraveling in real time. For him, chaos was not an accident but an calculated strategy working alongside his unlikely partner. He exploited internal fractures within the syndicate, feeding misinformation into channels already strained but disturbed. Anonymous tips reached certain lieutenant suggestion betrayal among their peers. Financial data was manipulated just enough to imply embezzlement. The goal was not immediate destruction, it was to force the syndicate to turn inward, to question to own foundation, and was working. Meeting grey heated, long standing alliances dissolved overnight. The tipping point came when a high-ranking commander was found dead in what initially appeared to be an assassination by a rival gang, but subtle inconsistencies at the scene told a different story. Evidence suggested internal eviction, clean, perceived, and symbolic word spread quickly through the criminal underworld. The syndicate was devouring itself. The signal incident shattered the perception of invincibility they had cultivated. Opportunistic Fenton began reclaiming small territories, emboldened by the idea that Gant could have blazed. Law enforcement, overwhelmed and politically constrained, struggled to respond effectively. Task forces were reactivated, but coordination faltered amid bureaucratic interference. Some officials secretly welcomed to syndicate stability, hoping it would weaken the organization without requiring direct information. Others feared the vacuum that might follow. History had shown that when one empire falls without structure to replace it, chaos does not disappear. It multiplies. The city stood on the edge of that possibility. Civilian before the brunt of the disorder. Small business were caught between completing demand for protection payment. Innocent bystanders were injured in crossfire meant for revival. Enforces emergency service stretched thin. A fires and shooting surged. News anchors spoke in urgent tones about rising crime rates and unprecedented unrest. Public trust eroded alongside safety. The city that once pulsed with vibrant nightlife and economic confidence now felt tense as though holding its breath. Amid the turmoil, he moved with cold focus. Each eruption of violence confirmed that the syndicate control was fracturing. Yet he understood the dangers of pushing too far too quickly. A wounded beast is often most dangerous when cornered. The unseen leader would not remain passive. Relocation was inevitable, and when it came, it would be calculated, a devastating. He prepared accordingly, adjusting tactics, recollecting safe houses, ensuring that his partner's digital footprint remained consolidated. As days passed, the choice reached crescendo. A coordinated blackout struck several districts simultaneously, followed by a massive explosion at the abandoned distribution center. Whether it was an act of sabotage or internal retaliation remained unclear, but the message was undeniable. The war had moved beyond quick manipulation into open information. Smoke rose into the night sky, illuminated by flashing emergency light and the distant rumble of helicopter. The city has cropped and threshold. In the midst of burning streets and fractured alliances, one truth became evident: control has shifted. The syndicate that one dictated the city rhythm was now reacting instead of commanding. Fear no longer flowed in a simple direction, it spread indiscriminately, touching criminal and civilian alike. When within that spreading chaos lay opportunity, the chance to strike decisively at the heart of empire struggling to hold itself together. But opportunity comes at a cost. As the city descended deeper into disorder, the line between calculated justice and uncontrollable destruction grew dangerously thin. Chaos has a way of loosening tongues and cracking open vaults that were meant to stay sealed forever. As the city reeled from escalating violence and the syndicates scrambled to maintain control, fragments of hidden story began surfacing. Secret layered beneath air of manipulation and blood. For him, the unraveling was not just strategic progress, it was personal. It deeper the hug, the more he realized that the brutal attack that shattered his life was not an isolated act of intimidation. It was connected to something far older, something disberatedly buried. It started with a file his partner recovered for a corrupted served tied to one of the syndicate financial shell. At first glance, it appeared to be routine accounting data, but embedded within the encrypted layers was a list of coded operation names dating back several years, operating that predate the syndicate. Visible rise cross referencing those code with achieved intelligence report revealed something unsettling. The syndicate had not simply emerged from the criminal underworld, it was involved from remnants for covert government operation that had quickly discovered. One operation in particular stood out. The common name Codeman matched a mission he had even assigned a year ago, one that ended in betrayal and bloodshed. Officially, the mission had been classified as a failed interdiction effort against an international arms broker. Unfortunately, it was result in the death of his teammates after their position was compromised. He had always suspected internal opposition, but he never had proof how starting eight encrypted correspondences that like that very mission to early financial transfer tied to the syndicate founder. A horrifying possibility emerged. The man who now led the syndicate had once been a shadow within the same covert network that trained him, not a field operative but a strategic architect, something responsible for logistical coordination and intelligence validation. That position granted access to classified data, operational route, and it if that individual had decided to monetize information instead of protect it, empire mission could be rerouted into ambushes for profit. Soldiers on the ground would never know they had been sacrificed for a hidden agenda. As they tracked deeper, another relationship surfaced. Survival high profile political figure currently advocating aggressive anti crime policies had historical financial ties to shell operation now unrolled by the syndicate. The connections were not direct enough to constitute immediate proof, but the pattern was undeniable. What had seemed like a purely criminal empire was an act and extension of thematic occupation that blurred the lines between law enforcement, politics, and organized crime. The syndicate was not operating beneath the system, it had roots within it. For him, the weight of his discovering was corruption, the death of his former teammates, the betrayal that forced into exile, even the attack on the warehouse. All of it fit into a larger narrative, had been targeted randomly. His quiet existence at the docks had placed into proximity to shipment and financial channel that connected back to those old operations. Perhaps the syndicate had feared that he would eventually recognize patterns, or perhaps someone within her ranks and discovered his identity and decided to eliminate a loose end from a forgotten chapter. The emotional impact was immediate and volatile. Anger surged not just at the syndicate but at the institution he once served. He had believed, despite everything, that occupation was isolated to a few head actor. Now he has continuum decision made ere ago had rippled outward, shaping a criminal empire that thrived on secret no one dared expose. His partner watched the shift in his expression and realization hardened into something colder than rage. This was no longer a vendetta, it was a exposes of truth. They faced a dilemma, revealing the information publicly could destabilize more than the syndicate. It would trigger political fallout, economic collapse, and possibly violent relational from those still embedded into power, keeping it hidden. However, would the occupation to perished? The secret was not just dangerous, it was explosive. It had the potential to dismantle career, government, and alliances built over years of deception. Once released, there would be no controlling the consequences. As if seeing the threat, the syndicate intensified its search for the source of recent breaches. Digital countermeasures increased, informants were interrogated with renewed brutality. Someone knew that classified history was blind, unearthed surveillance tightened around former governor, contractor, and ex-operative. The nose was slowly drawing closer, not just around him, but around anyone connected to his past. Secret that has remained dormant were now awakening powerful enemies. One night, while reviewing archived communication, his partner uncovered a final piece of evidence, a recorded exchange between the syndicate leader and a government liaison from year prior. The conversation confirmed coordination during the every mission that had cost his team their lives. It just not just negligence, it was deliberate orchestration. The ambush and had been a transaction, life traded by leverage and profit. Hearing the recording felt like reopening an old wound that had never truly held dead. Within the relation, the path format became both clear and more perilous. The syndicate foundation was built on secret that connected crime to authority in a way the public could secretly image. Exposing them would ignite and firestone, but leaving them burned would mean acceptation that the system was irreparably compromised. Standing in the dim glow of flickering scene, they understood one truth with painful carefully: some secret are burned for a reason, not to protect the innocent but to shield the powerful. And now that those secrets were in his hands, the cost of reeling them would be measured not just blood into the collapse of everything people through they understood about justice.
The moment the truth settled in his mind, hesitation disappeared. Grief had fueled him before, and anger had sharpened his focus, but now he had something far more dangerous: clarity. The syndicate was not just a criminal organization. It was the surviving limb of a corrupted system that had sacrificed soldiers and civilians alike for profit and control. Running was no longer an option. Hiding would only postpone the inevitable. If they had built their empire on buried secrets and calculated betrayal, then he would dismantle it with precision and relentless intent. The hunt had officially begun. He started by cutting off smaller arteries that fed the syndicate's strength. Safe houses, identified through financial leaks, were systematically neutralized. He moved at night, silent and methodical, disabling security systems before stepping inside like a ghost from a forgotten war. Weapons caches were emptied or destroyed. Communication hubs were sabotaged. He never stayed long enough to be tracked, and he never left unnecessary witnesses. Each operation was surgical, designed to create maximum disruption with minimal exposure. The goal wasn't chaos. Now it was controlled, dismantling. Word spread quickly through the underworld. An unknown force was targeting key assets with military efficiency. Survivors described a man who moved without hesitation, who anticipated counterattacks before they were launched. Some claimed he was former special forces. Others whispered that he was something worse, a weapon the syndicate itself had once forged and now lost control of. Fear shifted direction again. For the first time, mid-level commanders began requesting additional protection, not from external rivals, but from a single relentless adversary. His partner worked tirelessly in parallel, intercepting communications and mapping response patterns. Every time he struck, she analyzed the syndicate's reaction time, rerouted surveillance blind spots, and planted digital misdirection to conceal his movements. Together, they operated like two halves of a single machine, one analytical. When a retaliatory team was dispatched to a decoy location, it walked directly into a trap of its own making. Exposed and arrested after an anonymous tip alerted authorities. The syndicate's resources were thinning faster than anticipated. The unseen leader finally responded directly. A message was delivered through encrypted channels, addressed specifically to him. It wasn't a threat filled with rage. It was composed, almost respectful. The leader acknowledged his skill, even his persistence. He proposed a meeting neutral ground, no weapons, an opportunity to negotiate. It was a calculated psychological maneuver, designed to regain control by shifting the battlefield from action to conversation. But he knew better. Negotiation with a system built on betrayal was simply another trap. Instead of accepting the invitation, he intensified his campaign. He targeted financial intermediaries who facilitated offshore transactions, forcing sudden account freezes that rippled through the syndicate's liquidity. He intercepted a convoy transporting sensitive data drives and extracted critical information before disappearing into the night. Each success eroded the aura of invincibility that had protected the organization for years. Their responses grew more aggressive, less coordinated. Panic was replacing discipline. Retaliation came swiftly. A coordinated strike targeted one of his known former associates, someone who had once served beside him overseas. The message was clear. Anyone connected to him was vulnerable. He arrived too late to prevent the damage, but early enough to extract the survivor before authorities sealed off the scene. The sight reignited his fury, but he channeled it carefully. Recklessness would cost more lives. Precision would end the cycle. He adjusted tactics again, tightening operational security and isolating himself further to minimize collateral risk. As the hunt escalated, the city itself became a battleground of shadows. Abandoned factories, underground transit tunnels, and high-rise rooftops turned into arenas of pursuit. He anticipated ambushes and reversed them, using the environment to his advantage. In one encounter inside a dimly lit parking structure, he dismantled an entire tactical unit in under 3 minutes, leaving behind only stunned silence and unanswered questions. Surveillance footage, later reviewed by syndicate analysts, confirmed what they feared. He was not reacting randomly. He was systematically climbing the hierarchy. Inside the syndicate, fractures widened under the strain. Commanders blamed one another for intelligence failures. Resources were diverted from expansion to damage control. The leader's authority remained outwardly intact, but whispers circulated about his inability to eliminate a single adversary. That perception was more dangerous than any physical attack. Empires survive on fear and confidence. Once doubt seeps in, loyalty erodes quickly. The hunt was not only physical, it was psychological. Late one night, his partner uncovered the location of a secure operations hub used exclusively by the leader's inner circle. It was heavily fortified, shielded by both physical security and advanced encryption. Penetrating, it would require coordination and risk unlike anything they had attempted so far. But within that hub lay the final pieces of evidence records that could expose the full scope of corruption, linking past covert operations to present criminal dominance. Taking it down would cripple the syndicate beyond recovery. Standing on a rooftop overlooking the sleeping city, he studied the illuminated skyline with calm intensity. This was no longer about vengeance alone. It was about closure for his fallen teammates, for the woman he lost, and for a system twisted by greed. The hunt had stripped away hesitation and replaced it with unwavering purpose. Every step now led toward the heart of the empire, and as the distance between hunter and prey narrowed, one truth became undeniable. There would be no retreat, no compromise, and no mercy. And no mercy. By the time the night of reckoning arrived, the city felt unnaturally still, as if it sensed what was about to unfold. The secure operations hub stood on the outskirts of the industrial district, disguised as a logistics headquarters with legitimate paperwork and spotless compliance records. Behind its reinforced walls, however, lay the nerve center of the syndicate's empire servers, containing years of encrypted transactions, surveillance archives, blackmail files, and the final proof tying its leader to the betrayals of the past. It was more than a building. It was the heart of corruption, and tonight it would either survive or burn. He approached from the shadows, dressed in tactical black, movements steady and deliberate. His partner monitored everything remotely from a secured location, her voice calm in his earpiece as she guided him past rotating patrols and infrared sensors. She had spent weeks mapping the security grid, identifying brief windows of vulnerability between system refresh cycles. The margin for error was razor thin. One miscalculation would trigger lockdown protocols and seal him inside with heavily armed enforcers. But hesitation was no longer part of his nature. The first breach was silent. A maintenance access panel opened with precise timing, allowing him to slip into the lower level undetected. He neutralized two guards without firing a shot, dragging them into the darkness before their absence could raise suspicion. Every movement was economical, every breath controlled. Years of training resurfaced effortlessly, blending with the fury that had driven him here. This wasn't reckless vengeance. It was a calculated descent into the enemy's core. Inside the operations floor, rows of servers hummed with cold efficiency. Screens displayed live feeds of city districts, financial dashboards updating in real time, encrypted communications flowing like digital veins. For a brief moment, he stood still, absorbing the magnitude of what this place represented. Then his partner initiated the upload. Data began transferring to secure external drives. copying evidence that could dismantle the syndicate and expose the system that protected it. The countdown to detection had begun. Alarms erupted sooner than expected. A red glow flooded the corridors as security protocols activated. Heavy doors slammed shut, sealing off exits. Automated defenses locked into position. The leader had anticipated this possibility. Over the intercom, a calm voice echoed through the facility, measured, almost impressed. He was congratulated for making it this far. The tone carried no panic, only cold acknowledgement. The leader had remained inside, waiting for this confrontation. Armed units flooded the corridors. Gunfire erupted in bursts of controlled aggression. He moved through smoke and sparks, returning fire with lethal precision. Bullets ricocheted off steel beams, glass shattered, and flames ignited from ruptured fuel lines. The sterile environment transformed into a battlefield of chaos and destruction. Each fallen enforcer was another step closer to the core chamber where the leader waited. Pain grazed his shoulder as a round clipped him, but he barely registered it. Momentum mattered more than wounds. Reaching the central chamber required forcing open a reinforced blast door. His partner overrode the locking mechanism for a split second, just enough for him to wedge it open before the system reset. Inside, the leader stood alone, no visible weapon, posture relaxed. The room was illuminated by flickering monitors displaying fragments of the uploaded data. For the first time, they faced each other without intermediaries or encrypted channels. The conversation was brief, but charged with years of buried truth. The leader didn't deny orchestrating the mission that killed his team. He framed it as necessary collateral for greater strategic positioning. He spoke of power structures, of systems that required sacrifice to maintain stability. In his mind, betrayal was not personal. It was pragmatic. When questioned about the warehouse attack and the woman who died, he dismissed it as an unfortunate consequence of unfinished business. That dismissal ignited something raw and uncontainable. The fight that followed was brutal and close quarters, more primal than tactical. The leader proved far from defenseless, strained, disciplined, and fueled by his own conviction. They clashed amid shattered glass and burning consoles, trading blows that echoed through the chamber. Blood stained the polished floor as fire spread from ruptured circuits. The building's structural alarms warned of imminent collapse. Outside, emergency sirens wailed in the distance, too far to intervene in time. In the final exchange, strength alone was not decisive. It was resolve. He fought not for power or dominance, but for those who had been erased by calculated greed. With one final, devastating strike, he ended the confrontation. The leader collapsed, the calm mask finally shattered. Flames consumed the last active monitors, erasing the illusion of control that had defined the Empire. His partner confirmed the data transfer was complete. The truth was secured. As the facility burned behind him, he stepped into the night air thick with smoke and falling embers. Fire illuminated the skyline, a signal that the syndicate's heart had stopped beating. But victory carried no celebration. It carried weight, the weight of lives lost and systems exposed. The final showdown had been written in blood and sealed in fire. What remained uncertain was not whether the Empire had fallen, but what would rise from its ashes. Rise from its ashes.
In the shadow alley of a city teeming with crime, justice comes at a deadly place, open a pulse-pounding scene that immediately set the tunes of a unrelenting action thriller. Jason Statham, portraying a 100x special force operative, is seen navigating the chaos of a bustling marketplace when a enraged bull, spurred by panicked crowds, charged through the streets, stopping vegetable carts and sending vendors into frantic scream. The camera expertly captures the raw intensity of the movement, blending kinetic energy with close-up shots of Statham stately expression, signaling a man whose life has been defined by confrontation and survival. Thumb character who past is cloaked in secrecy and moral complexity emerges as both a protector and a vigilant, someone who has lived on the fringe of law and society yet cries an unwearying personal code as he subdues the immediate threat, a subtle but telling exchange with vengeance. The city itself is alive, almost a character in its own right, with its dimly lit streets, graffiti sprayed walls, and neon reflection in rain-slicked asphalt, conveying as word were dangerous lurks in every shadow. In this opening sequences, the audience is not merely shown action but invited into a narrative that promises moral dilemmas. High-octane sequences add a intricate interplay between past traumas and present decision. Alongside Statham, Michael Peña entire the story as a law enforcement officer with his own complicated relationship to the justice system. Peña portrayal balances the final impulsive physically with grounded emotionally movement, creating a dynamic tension between the who leads that drive the narrative forward. The narrative, the layered with subtext, every word glance with hesitation undercrosses a shared recognition of the stake, a hand hiding, and his story is neither fully revealed. As the plot unfolds, Statham's character is drawn into a involved web of criminal enterprise, corrupt official, and personal vendettas, each confrontation escalating in intensity and consequences. The film packing is relentless yet calculated, allowing moment of character introspection to breathe amid relentless charge sequences, hand-to-hand combat, and ridiculously choreographed shootouts. Thematically, the movie explores the cost of justice when pushed outside consensual structure, questioning whether retribution can ever be truly justified and what human experiences with each scene. The cinematography accentuates tension through spark contrasts between light and shadow, were establishing sort of urban decay and rapid intimate close up that immerse viewing in the immediately of dangerous. The sound design complement the visual, from the metallic clash of weapon to the ambient chaos of the city, forging an auditory landscape as gripping as the visual spectacle. Beyond the adrenaline flooded sequences, the narrative delves into the personal stake for each character, exposing loyalty, betrayal, and the moral compromise that define their choice. But the end of the opening character, the audience finally entrenched in a world where justice is not rendered but carved through sheer will, physically possess, and justice invariable deeds.